Welcome to everybody. It is a special pleasure to see everybody together again. And this morning we're taking our next step together in the topic of the what and the why of prayer. This is the topic. This episode is the fourth part where we're looking at Elokai Neshama. Full disclosure is that I want to do shorter on each topic, but it happens to be that this topic has a lot of depth. And it serves as a very good example that relates to many other brachas. And we'll see why in just a short moment. So what is Elokai Neshama? It is printed before our davening begins in shul, technically speaking. So nobody is saying this out loud. They're saying it to themselves. We'll notice and perhaps we'll think about why it is actually presented in the singular rather than the plural. It's not a generic bracha. It's a very particular bracha. And the bracha reads as follows. Let's just do a quick recap. Elokai, my God, Neshama shenosata bi. The soul which you placed in me, taharahi, it is pure. Ata v'ra'asa, ata yatzarta, ata nafachta bi. You created it, you fashioned it, you blew it into me. Those are the three different spiritual realms, of course, that we're noticing here. V'ata meshamra b'kirbi, you guarded in my midst. V'ata asid li la mimeni ulachzira bi le'asid lava. You're going to take it from me. You're going to return it to me. As long as the soul is within my midst, I thank you. Hashem Elokai Avosai, Riboin Kol HaMa'asim, Adon Kol HaNeshamos, the master of the universe and all action and souls. Baruch Ata Hashem Machzir Neshamos Difkarim Mesim. You return restore the soul to dead bodies. Okay, it's a very powerful bracha. It's usually one which we are sometimes rushing just because of arriving in shul, and sometimes I'm sure let's say if one has been asked to daven for the Amud on the men's side of this equation, and one has to jump to the Amud, it becomes difficult to do this. So let's just do a little bit of background as to what we're supposed to be doing, how this expresses itself. So, when does one say this bracha specifically? So it actually happens to be a matter of great debate, and we're going to spend a little bit of time understanding and appreciating the depth of this. But technically speaking, it should be said after Asher Yatzar, after the bracha that we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for a healthy body. We'll see in a second why that might not be so simple. What if we forget to say it? So let's say one is presented with that situation where, let's say, one has that variant gene called Gabai gene. I think it's something people are born with personally. It's a certain sort of variance which has a certain responsibility that no matter where they go, they're going to organize things. It's a wonderful gene mutation. And what happens is that you're sometimes in that situation and you come to shul and there's no one else who's doing it, and you naturally take the responsibility for the circumstance, and you have to start davening because nobody else is starting to davening, and they would still be there schmoozing with each other than 10 minutes later if it weren't for you going to be doing something. So you start davening, but you didn't get a chance to say Elokai Neshama because it was before davening. So what do you do in such a situation? So interestingly enough, Elokai Neshama is one of these brachas which is said before davening, which actually has a parallel twin during the davening. And therefore, if a person were not to say it before the davening, a person would forfeit the ability to be able to say it after the davening. What is its parallel bracha? What is its twin? And the answer is the second bracha in the Shemona Esrei, where we talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we talk about how Hashem restores life, resurrects the dead, and that really is what the topic of this bracha is. The micro resurrection which occurs every morning, the macro resurrection which occurs at the time in the future, which is what we say in the second bracha, Baruch Ata Hashem Mechayei HaMeisim, that Hashem restores those who are dead. That is going to therefore parallel it. So therefore, if a person misses it out and has come to the end of davening and realizes that one missed it out, should one be saying it? The answer is no, because Mechayei Meisem covered it. But here's the trick. Let's say that you remember not at the end of davening, but in the middle of davening, that you had got into this circumstance. So now, here's the problem. On the one hand, you have the lights coming down the road at you, which is Mechayei Meisem, the second bracha in the Shemona Esrei. But on the other hand, you didn't say it. So what do you do now? So do you just wait to so to speak, get the second train? Or is there something you can do? So the truth is that in such a circumstance, so let's say we're in Pesukei de Zimra, and we remember that one didn't get a chance to, and remember one's not supposed to speak in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra. Nonetheless, this is one of the exceptions. You're allowed to say Elokai Neshama in order to avoid having to use the second bracha in the Shemona Esrei for it. Similarly, even if one were in the Kriya Shema area, the next stage of davening, one would be able to do it bein haprakim, right? So let's say between Yotzera Ma'oros and Avarabba, a person would say Elokai Neshama and then continue in order to avoid being in such a circumstance. And if ultimately one were to get to Shemona Esrei and has realized that one did not do Elokai Neshama, one should actually say the bracha, the second bracha of Shemona Esrei, trying to intend not to say Elokai Neshama, so one can still say it after davening. So just to be aware of this, because by default one would be able to be Yotzei on this. And what happens if? Yes, Tibi.
One question. Right after Ashiyasa, but the Siddur doesn't have. I don't know if he's
Good, yeah, so we're going to discuss in a second, Tibi. You're right. Siddurs have different variations of printing, and we're going to get to why that is in a second. I've always wondered about that, and there's a lot of very fascinating arguments which we're going to address today. And finally, what about the all-nighters? I'm pulling an all-nighter, it's Shavuos night, so what do I do in the morning? And the answer is it depends if you are of Spanish or Germanic descent. If you are a Sephardi, you may say Elokai Neshama, but if you are a Ashkenazi, then you would not say Elokai Neshama. Okay, so in the morning, and therefore rely on somebody else to be able to do that. Okay, so that is our that's a general overview. Now let's dig into the depth of the depth of the way. Esther Moish, there we go. Here we are. Sorry, if somebody could send this. Thank you so much, Eliezer. There we go. So let's start at the beginning. Why is this topic such a fascinating topic? Because it turns out that Elokai Neshama is an anomaly. It's a very unusual bracha, and in order to be able to zone in to try to get the high definition outline of it, it helps us analyze the general concept of brachas, which is why we're going to do it this way. So let's start at the beginning. Why is it so unusual? It's unusual for a number of reasons. So let's go back to basics. The Gemara in Brachas talks about this bracha. It's important to always look at things in terms of context. So the Gemara actually starts off on Daf Samach and Beis talking about a different bracha. The bracha it talks about at the beginning is, in source 1, Hanichnas lishon al mitasa, a person who is about to go to sleep on their bed. Omer Shema Mishma Yisrael ad v'haya im Shema. So a person says Shema until Vayam Shemaya, and then at such point, Vayam Baruch HaMapil Chevlei Shena Me'al Einayis Numayal Hapoin. It goes through the nusach of this blessing with this supplication, and it's a very beautiful bracha, which should really always be the last thing one does before going to sleep. We'll discuss that, God willing, when we get towards the end of the day later on. Right after that, the next thing the Gemara tells us is ki mita'er, when a person wakes up, then Omer Elokai Neshama shenasata bi taharahi, or tahara. You notice it leaves out the word he. And this is where the Gemara references this. Okay, so you see this over here as the starting point. What do you see just as an interesting aside over here, from in terms of the structure of the day? Is there Asher Yatzar in this Gemara? The answer is no, right? So it's interesting that it does not reference the Elokai Neshama to Asher Yatzar. It seems to sort of talk about it as the normal pattern of one's day, right? One goes to sleep, there's a bracha. When he wakes up, there's a bracha, and so on. So that we have to think about where Asher Yatzar relates to it as well. One also have to think of how does Modeh Ani relate to it, because it has its own Modeh in it. It has its own admission in it at the end that we relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we say that Hashem, you're the master of all the souls. So how do Modeh Ani and it compare? How do it and Asher Yatzar compare? And why is the Gemara absent in terms of talking Asher Yatzar, which was prior to that was the previous paragraph in the Gemara itself. So here's where it gets complicated. Is it turns out that there are specific template formats for how brachas work, and we may not notice this actively, but this is true about everything we do. The Gemara says, and this Gemara appears a number of times in Shas. One is on Psachim Daf Kuf Hayamud Aleph, and the other one is in Brachos Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph, where the Gemara says the following format for brachos that every bracha has to follow, with many exceptions. So the general format is, as the Gemara tells us, every blessing starts and ends with a baruch. Can anybody think of a default example, just for a moment? What was that? Asher Yatzar, fantastic. Asher Yatzar starts the baruch, ends the baruch. Any other examples in the course of our day, our week? Kiddush, Friday night. God, so the second bracha clearly starts and ends. Any other brachas? Havdalah, right? Bracha Achrona, right? Borei Nefashos, right? Ein Shalosh, the what we call Al Michya, right? Baruch She'omar is the same way. And then other examples are as well, at the end of the Birkas HaShachar, Gomel Chasadim Tovim Amo Yisrael, those bigger brachas, when you have a paragraph, it starts and it ends with a baruch. Okay, that's the default rule.
Hallel.
What was that? Hallel starts and ends with a baruch. Right, so you have all these brachas, which that we'll call that default. That's supposed to be the way it is. However, there are exceptions. So the Gemara now goes on. It's actually a brisa, gives examples, exceptions. Chutz mi birkas mitzvos, birkas peiros, ubracha samucha lachaverta, ubracha achrona shebekriya shema. There are three categories in one example that I'll give it over here. So one is birkas mitzvah. So what's an example of birkas mitzvah? Tzitzis, right? So tzitzis, shofar, lulav. So it doesn't start and end with the bracha. It kind of just starts, right? There's no. So it just says Baruch Atah Shalom Kenem Melech Haolam, Asher Kiddush Shalom V'Mitzvah Tzivanu. That's the extra, added template for a Birkas HaMitzvah. You command us in the mitzvah. You gave us the opportunity to the mitzvah. Al Netilas Lulav. There's no extra. There's no preamble. There's no epilogue. It's just as it is. Why is that? The Rashbam, that's Rabbeinu Shmuel, Rashi's grandson, on the Gemara in Pesachim says very simple. I just put it below in source 5. We don't need to read it inside at this point, but just for reference. So he says the reason is because there's not so many details. It's not like we need to explain to ourselves. Now, we're not explaining to Hashem. Hashem knows why He commanded us these things. But we don't need to explain to ourselves so much. Hashem, you gave us the opportunity of doing something which is going to be immortal, something which has infinite capacity to change ourselves. So it's very simple. Hashem, you told us to. What it is, Sheikh Lulav, put up a fence, whatever the mitzvah is that we're doing. Very little explanation needed, so therefore it's short. The other one is Birkas HaPeira. So that is the brachas before we eat, right? Baruch Atah Shalom Kanachim, B'rei Priya Eitz. Again, there's no preamble, no epilogue. It's very sort of self-explanatory. Less explaining necessary. When there's less explaining necessary, all it is just the header. That's what it seems to be. That's and that's what we think about a lot of brachas. Now, the one that's intriguing to us over here is bracha hasamucha lechaverta. A bracha which is next to another bracha. What is a classic example of a bracha hasamucha lechaverta? Share brachas, but you're getting too complicated because all of them are really micro brachas in a certain sense. This should be the most obvious. The whole of Shemona Esrei. Think about this for a second. The only bracha in Shemona Esrei which begins with the baruch and ends with the baruch is bracha number 1. But every other bracha starts off already in the subject, right? So the next one is Atah Gibor Olam Hashem, right? Atah Kadosh, you are holy. Atah Chonein Ladam Das, right? So we all the brachas there do not begin with the baruch. Why not? Because in a certain sense they've been anchored by the first bracha, which begins Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Elokeinu Elokeinu, and they all lean, so to speak, on that first bracha. Other examples are, where else do we see this type of pattern? Same thing with Birkas Kriya Shema. Right, so we have, before Kriya Shema, there are always two brachas. The first one starts, Baruch Atah Hashem, ends with the Baruch Atah Hashem. The second one, Ava Rabba Avas Alam, whatever the nusach we're using is, that never starts with the Baruch. Why? Because it's leaning on the first bracha in that pattern, right? So it's sort of set up as this in that way. So yes, there is content. There's more explaining necessary in the bracha, but we don't need to start with the bracha because we already, so to speak, set the tone for this blessing. So that's why the brisa had to explain. And what's the other example is the bracha after the Kriya Shema. Why does it need to say that? Because how does that? Because there's Kriya Shema in the middle. Think about it. How does the third bracha of the Kriya Shema start? It's afterwards. It starts with the words Emes ve'emunah or Emes ve'yatziv, and there's no baruch at the beginning, and it's not technically smucha lechaverta. It's not technically right adjacent to the previous bracha because what's in between is Kriya Shema. So the brisa makes a note that this is a little we'll call it stretched bracha samucha lechaverta. Okay, so default. If you have a short idea, a birkas mitzvah or birkas haperos, then it's short. It's just a heading. Any bracha which has expansion in it has a bracha at the beginning and the end, unless it is leaning backwards on another bracha which is naturally adjacent to it. Naturally is actually something we could investigate because there are ways of creating bracha samucha lechaverta. As an example, can anybody think of an example of where you have to create a situation of bracha hasamucha lechaverta? This is for those brachas B folks out there. Where is an example where you try to create a bracha hasamucha lechaverta situation? Birkas Kohanim, no. Good guess though, because there is a bracha there. This is an interesting aside. is Tfilas Haderech. Okay, so Tfilas Haderech does not start with a bracha. It starts as a Yiratzon, so it's a Yiratzon. So where's the bracha at the beginning? So actually, many of the poskim say it's a good idea to say a Borei Minei Mezonos before saying the thing, to create the situation where one's framed it, starting with the bracha. Just interesting aside as one of the sort of anomalies of this application. Interesting. Okay, be it as it may. Now let's dig it a little further. So the Gemara then says, Sheyesh mehem. This is actually still the Brisa. Sheyesh mehem poseach b'baruch ve'en chosim b'baruch v'yesh mehem shechosim b'baruch ve'en poseach b'baruch. In these exceptional cases, some of them start off just sort of on the subject and end with a bracha, and some of them start with a bracha and don't end with a bracha as well. They are not capped on either end. So the Gemara gives an example. V'atoiv v'hametiv poseach b'baruch ve'en chosim b'baruch. What's an example of a bracha which starts with the blessing but does not end with the blessing is hatoiv v'hametiv. What is that referring to? What is hatoiv v'hametiv? This is not the bracha said on wine. What is this referring to? There is a Tov Metiv which is referred to wine or good tidings which affect multiple people. What is this bracha? This is what we sing. We sing it's the fourth bracha of benching. So let's think about this. Benching works the same way. It's three brachos hasmuchos lachaverta. Baruch atah Hashem, hazanis olam kula b'tavai, right? And then we get to the next one. What's the next bracha start off is? No telecha. Though the next bracha start with rachemna. So those brachos are smuchos lachaverta. They're leaning on bracha number 1, which is why they don't start. And then the funny thing happens is bracha number 4. Bracha number 4 is Baruch atah Hashem. We now start a new bracha, and it doesn't end with a bracha. When does it end? Right, most people are not aware of this. Al Yachasreinu, that's where the Amen belongs. But there's no bracha to tell us at the end, which is why most people don't know that it's ending, right? So it's like a sort of a long paragraph where it sort of falls off the cliff. Why is that? So the Rashbam explains, which makes a lot of sense, is it was instituted at a different period in history. The first 3 brachas were actually established sequentially at different points. So the Hazanas Olam was instituted by Moshe Rabbeinu when the man fell. When we talk about Hashem sustaining us directly, and we took that as part of our liturgy. Then the next stage was Noidelecha, refers to the next stage in history, which was Yoshua when we conquered the land of Israel, which is why the topic is the land of Israel, and circumcision, which were 2 things that Yoshua enabled. Then the next bracha of Rachemna is David and later on Shlomo HaMelech, because we talk about Yerushalayim Irecha, which was not there at the time of Yoshua, accessible at least. So those were instituted, and therefore we're talking at the times of Tanakh. The Hatav HaMeitiv was instituted long past the closing of Tanakh by the Anshe Knesset Agdola, or actually no, after Anshe Knesset Agdola by Chazal, at the time of the fall of the last sovereign bastion in the Roman revolt, Beitar against the Romans, which was quelled in the year 135-ish Common Era, and after the Romans destroyed the city, killed everybody, every living soul in the city, they did not allow us access to the city to even bury the dead. And it was after a number of months that we were given access, and there was a miracle which happened that none of the bodies decomposed. So when we were able to get access to the dead to bury them, upon that time, the Chazal said we were going to institute a special bracha, the 4th bracha in benching, because it's such a monumental moment. And they said Ha'tov HaMeitiv, which is why it was instituted separately, so it is not considered smucha lachaverta. It isn't leaning on the previous ones, because we're talking about hundreds of years in between its institution and the original benching, and it's therefore distinguished in that way. Just as an interesting aside as to what this is, and we're not going into why it is that this was the fitting event to create a new bracha as opposed to many other events where we could have found this. So here, that's what the Gemara says, which now leads us to a question, because here you have a bracha which you say every morning, Elokai Neshama, and you notice it doesn't start with a baruch. It just stands all by itself, and then the question is, why? What is it? Why is this? So it's got content, right? So we are explaining something to ourselves. We're praising Hashem about something, we're asking about something, but at the same time, there's no baruch at the beginning. So that is the question which so many of the poets can deal with. So we'd like to explore 3 different avenues, each one of them yielding a very different outcome in understanding the content of this particular bracha, which is why it's such a fascinating bracha to analyze. The first observation is something I found, which is in the Kesef Mishnah, Rav Yosef Karo, and this is sort of, he mentions this as a side comment. So this is why it's such a fascinating topic to analyze, because we're talking about the rules of brachas. When Anshe Knesset Agdola made brachas for us, we were no longer in that, so to speak, organic stage of poetry, where I feel this kinship and endearment to my Creator, and I burst forth in song as I'm about to eat my bread. No, Anshe Knesset Agdola says we're going to give you this textbook structure of how to do this, and this is what you need. And anytime you make a regulation, there are rules. You can't just regulate something and give an idea. You have to have very precise rules. What are the rules? So the Rambam says in source 4, the Rambam in Mishnah Torah in Brachos says the following: "V'nusa kol habrachos Ezra ubeis dinah tiknam." When Ezra came back to the land of Israel at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash, he instituted blessings. Don't add, don't subtract. He got it right. A person who decides to, so to speak, have their own poetic license in the brachos is a mistake. Now, that does not mean to say we can't speak to Hashem in our own words and thank Him for things in our own way. We should. But when it comes to brachos, we should use the machinery given to us because he got it right. He knew what he was doing. He was part of this entity called Anshe Knesset Agdola. Among them, many prophets who utilized this as the way to say the correct phraseology. We'll call bracha she'ein bo haskaras shem u'malchus eina bracha. So 2 ingredients necessary is to have shem. What's shem? Hashem's name, right? And malchus. What's malchus? Melech haolam. Right. So by the way, actually it happens to be I was at Abdullah at somebody's house a little while back, and they reached the end of the Hamavdil, and then somebody said, "I don't think you said Melech haolam." I just said Baruch Atah Hashem, Hamavdil ben Kodesh Chol ben Oloch Hashech, right? And it's so easy to do that, right? And you have to repeat the bracha. Because the Rabbi says you need to have those 2 things. You need Shem and Malchus. Okay, you need to have both of those things. Elohim Kain, unless it was dependent on the one next to it. Okay, so the Kesef Mishnah, Rabbi Yosef Karo, makes an observation on this. And he says, which is not considered the whole thing, but he says in the second line, at the end of the second line in source 5, he says, V'hachi nichali birkas Elokai Neshama. This now explains to me how Elokai Neshama works. She'ein bo Malchus, we don't say Melech haolam in it, right? So how's it a bracha? Baruch atah Hashem machzir neshamos levgarim mesim. We don't mention Hashem's malchus. He says v'gam eino samucha na'asher yatzar. It isn't even close. It's not necessarily printed right after Asher yatzar. Deha meikar levado hiskinua. It was established independently, as we see in the Gemara we looked at, which is not next to Asher yatzar. Kimitai mishanasai leimel Elokai Neshama. Ela vaday must be came into kamar Elokai chashiv k'moi malchus. By saying this bracha, you start with God's name. If you start with God's name, it's like mentioning His monarchy. It's like mentioning that it's His name and His monarchy in the same word. That's what the Kesef Mishnah suggests. Why it acts differently. So all the other brachas where we start off, so to speak, without a Atah Gibor, all the other brachas which are Samuchas Lachavet and so on, there's no mention, so to speak, of God at the beginning. This is the first word, is Hashem. If we're mentioning Hashem, that's why, so to speak, it is a pseudo mentioning of Shem v'Malchus in the bracha, as would be suggested. Now, this is we'll call this an answer on technicality, right? Because that means to say that really it is what we are expecting it to be. We didn't recognize it, right? So technically speaking, it is the bracha that begins with Baruch and it has Melech haolam. Why? Because we started with Hashem's name, but it could be more than that. So these last 2 avenues, I think, are really, really fascinating observations. So the first is the following. This is the Tosfos and Brachos, and this is, I would suggest, the predominant view of the Rishonim, of most of the Rishonim, which is as follows. The bracha, the Tosfos is found in Brachos Mem Vav Amud Aleph, and it's elsewhere as well. The Tosfos says the following. We're starting with the second line. He says, Elokai Neshama ama ena posachas babaruch. Why does Elokai Neshama not start with the regular baruch, like a default bracha? Daina samuchala asher yatzar. It's not next to asher yatzar. Kagonim loy ba mina nekavim diyadav taharos ein zarg lebirkas asher yatzar. That's how you went to the bathroom beforehand. You no longer need to say asher yatzar at this point in time. So then it's not really dependent. Tzarich loymar hoyil ve'ein ba elo hayda ba'alma. Eina posachas babaruch, mikol makom chasemes babaruch, hoyel va'aruka ksas. He says, you know why? Because the nature of this bracha is a bracha in which it is a bracha on thanksgiving. And a thanksgiving bracha does not need to close, to have to follow the same rules. Now, where does he get that from? Where do they get this from? Where do the Tosfos get this from? If you remember our short list in the Gemara and Brachos, the short list in the Gemara and Brachos didn't mention this, right? It didn't mention this at all, right? There was Birkas HaPeiros, and there was Birkas HaMitzvos, and then there was and there was the third bracha of Kriyas Shema, Brachas Smucha Lachaverta. But this is none of them. So some of the Rishonim try to understand the later poskim understand that what Tosfos is referring to is, remember the bracha HaTov HaMeitiv? What type of bracha is that? The fourth bracha in the benching. That's thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for this moment in Jewish history. This is like that. That's what Tosfos is saying. It doesn't follow the same rules when you have a Birkas Hodah. Very unusual. So it follows its own rules, it beats to its own drum beat, and therefore it doesn't require that. Unusual. It's hard to think of other brachas where you have such a bracha. The other example that's referenced is the Birkas HaGeshamim, which is not a bracha we say, the bracha on rain. But we don't usually say that bracha on it because we need to have such a preponderance of rain here in Long Island. It would be an interesting question. But nonetheless, this Tosfos says it operates unusually, which actually leads us to a fascinating observation. There is a question asked by Rav Chaim Pilagi, who's a Kabbalistic, halachic decisive on Shulchan Aruch, and he wrote many stories. He wrote in a book called Chaim L'Rosh. He asks the following very basic question. Think about this for a second. When we talk about the Birkas HaShachar, which we're going to get to in the coming sessions together, we have a lot of the brachas that we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all kinds of so to speak, things. We thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we pakach ivrim, that He opens our eyes, right? That we talk about the fact that we can sit, we can stand, or so to speak, all bodily functions. We start detailing. It's like a sort of a list of all the things that we have the ability to be able to do. There's one bracha which is absent from that list, and that is the bracha thanking Hashem for speech. We never say thank you Hashem for allowing us and enabling us to speak. We talk about all the other functions that we're able to. It goes with strength, and it crowns us with glory. All the different things that we're able to do. But in the end of the day, we don't ever thank Hashem for the capacity to speak. And so says Rav Chaim Pilagi, our answer is that's what Elokai Neshama is. When does a person have speech? And we're not talking about sleep talking, apparently. For those who are in the parasha or have somebody else in the house who is in the parasha. But in the end of the day, we're talking about intelligent speak as an expression of the soul being in the body. And therefore, when am I thanking Hashem for my ability and my creative capacity to be able to speak is Elokai Neshama, which explains why he says, therefore, why it is that this bracha is in fact connected to Asher Yatzar as well. Now this is a slightly different from what Tosfos is saying, but why? Because how does Asher Yatzar end? Asher Yatzar ends with the bracha, Baruch Ata Hashem, Mafli Kol Basar, Rafei Kol Basaru Mafli La'asos. What does the word Mafli mean? Exactly. How do you translate that? Wonder, like the word Pele, right? So here's a funny thing. When the Rambam codifies the halachas of all Nadarim, Shvuos, Charamim, when a person takes upon themselves some sort of, so to speak, higher calling and responsibility, where does the Rambam put all those halachas? In what category of halacha? Does anyone remember what that's called? It's called hafla'ah, which hafla'ah also means expression. The Ramah explains, what does it mean mafli la'asos in the end of Asher Yatzar? We finished talking about how the body operates. That was last time. And the incredible function of the body. We end off with mafli la'asos, says the Ramah, that is the fact that a soul is connected to this body. And that the wonder is that the spirit and the material are interconnected and cannot escape each other. That's what mafli la'asos, that's the wonder. And that mafli expresses itself in pele, in hafla'ah, which is articulation. Comes straight into the next bracha. What is that? Elokai Neshama, that soul endows me with the ability to break and create through speech, which is what Elokai Neshama is. So, two ways of looking at this in this mahalach. One is it's either Birkas Ha'edah, like Tosfos has said, it's its own thanksgiving for my being here, or it is the Asher Yatzar, it's the connection. And why is it connected to Asher Yatzar? Asher Yatzar was the platform works, and now the software works, right? So meaning to say, the hardware is operating, and by the way, it's connected to this incredible system, and the algorithm's operating, and now I can do what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm not just a primate walking around. I'm able to do something bigger. That's the Elokai Neshama. So looking at it as that, which is why these are. I just kind of merged this, and I apologize for being less clear. Tosfos says it's a Birkas Ha'edah, and most of the poskim, like the Rosh and many of the other poskim, say it is really, technically speaking, connected to Asher Yatzar. Why? So thematically, but also halachically, therefore rendering it a bracha hasamucha lechaverta, leaning upon Asher Yatzar. And that's why it should be done as such. And that's why we'll notice that some Sidurim have it that Asher Yatzar is printed right before Elokai Neshama. Just by a show of hands, who uses a siddur like that? Okay, it's interesting. So Ari and Sfarad actually usually do it more. Rani, as well, Eretz Yisrael Siddurim sometimes have this as well more. But most Siddurim don't, which means that most Siddurim in a certain sense view it a little differently. Why is that? because of the next answer. This is an answer which is actually tucked away in an unusual place. It is found in the Tosfos Harosh. Tosfos Harosh is a commentary on Tosfos, attributed to the Rosh, and it has Tosfos, but it adds little extras. So if one ever is struggling with Tosfos, which is usually, then it's always a good idea to look at the Tosfos Harosh or the Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz, who add an extra avenue. So in that, he adds a line which is not to be found in regular Tosfos, where he says in source 7 the following observation. Kimitari Omer Elokai Neshama, this is on Tosfos Daf Samach. Av al pi she'aruka ena posachas bebaruch she'ena Elokai da ba'alma kedeprecious le'el b'peri gimel she'achlu. So this is the Tosfos that we just saw. It's a Birkas Ha'edah, it's a Thanksgiving bracha, which doesn't follow the same rules of operation. Now, v'aravid, this is Rav Avram based in. Kosav dehi samucha lebirkas hamapil chevlei sheina desheina loy havya hefsek. Says what is? It's actually is this a bracha samucha lachaver? It's leaning on another bracha, but it's not leaning on Asher Yotzar, which is why the Gemara did not put Asher Yotzar immediately before it in the stages of the day. What bracha is it leaning upon? It is leaning upon the bracha of hamapil. Therefore, your sleep, in a certain sense, is not considered a hefsek. It is these brachas are the framework or the brackets to the experience of sleep. Fascinating. This is what the Raavad says. Now, if this is the case, this would explain why some Sidurim, so to speak, release it from the Asher Yotzar. Because if this is the case, it doesn't need to be near the Asher Yotzar. It's not related to the Asher Yotzar. It's related to the Hamapil. So here's an interesting observation in terms of halacha. Halacha, it should go before. You're right. Should be even earlier according to this. But here's an interesting observation as to perhaps a proof about this. We know that there's a halacha that a person is supposed to be saying every day 100 brachas. A person is supposed to try to accumulate that. I've always been interested in creating, we have pedometers for the amount of steps we take. I still have not yet worked out how to do it for the brachas yet. But can you imagine, the explosions of the fireworks, it buzzes every time you just get that last bracha. You went to the bathroom just the right time, you get the 100, you feel so great, right? You print out your weekly report. The trouble is Shabbos, which is where you need it most. Right? It's the same thing with pedometers, right? If our insurance companies knew how many steps we took on Shabbos, it would just cover all the 10,000s of the rest of the week, right backwards. But nonetheless, okay, so it's an invention yet to be made. The 100 brachos. The Mishnah Berurah codifies this, and he says, let me tell you how you start counting. So take a look at this fascinating Mishnah Berurah. This is later on in Siman Memvav, in source 8. He says, there were 100 people dying per day. Tikin David has there. Nevarech 100 brachas b'chol yom. So David Melech says you should bench 100 brachas a day. V'nei b'chol yom anu mevarchim oid yoser mi 100 brachas. This is on a regular day. If we're doing all our davening, we're doing all our brachas, we're doing more than 100. Keitzad b'layan lakashoy lech lishon mevarech hamapil v'shacha mevarech al nitzilas yadayim b'asher. What does he start with? How does the day begin? How does the day begin according to the Mishnah Berurah when you start the clock counting? Hamapil. Now, if you're going to say, that's because in the Jewish calendar, you know what, night is the beginning, right? Well, then you should have started with Mariv, right? Right? We do Mariv first. So then there's all the Birkas Kriyash Man, there's a Shmona Esrei, that's 19, and then another 5, right? There's a lot of other brachas in. What about supper? Right? So he doesn't. He starts with Hamapil. What's interesting about this? He shows an interesting thing. It's almost as if, when does the day really begin? The day begins before you go to sleep. That's fascinating. Now, let's think about this in terms of like a healthy person. That means to say, and this has been proven, that a person who expresses or writes down things that they are grateful for before they go to sleep and they take a gratitude diary, physiologically, chemically have been shown to have better sleep. This is not just like, I'm feeling in a good mood. This means to say that the tone in which a person goes to sleep, it's been shown, studies that a person goes to sleep with a screen. Right? The blue light affects the way a person is going to sleep. The way a person puts themselves to sleep is the way the person wakes up as well. How successful and effective that sleep is going to be. How refreshing and replenishing that sleep is going to be for that person. What Chazal knew before all these research came along is that's precisely the point. So what did Chazal do? They framed the sleep experience with really essentially it's one bracha, right? It's at the beginning is Amapil Shena HaKadosh Baruch Hu depositing, right? So sort of like, when you check in, I'm checking in the keys, I'm putting them on the counter, and now I'm taking them back. So that's what's happening. Neshama is being checked in, Neshama is being checked out. There's a bracha at the beginning, which is why Elokai Neshama does not start with the baruch, because the process started. My day began with how I started. What they say is, you can't get up like a lion if you went to bed like a dog. Right? That's the way it goes. You can't if you just sort of lopsided across the couch, it's very hard to be the person getting up like strong in the morning. one has to start the process and plan it in such a way. That's what's being said over here, and that's a very profound insight as to the Elokai Neshama, which is why, based on these different ideologies, therefore you'll see different streams in the poskim as to when it belongs. There are poskim who will say that, technically speaking, based on the fact that in the Gemara it seems like an independent bracha, or as the Gemara shows, what was the previous bracha to it? Hamapil, which is the why the Raavad is saying this. So therefore, it is not necessary to connect it to Ashiyatzar. And in fact, when giving the Seder Hayom, there are poskim who say that it should go. How does it go? Al Netilas Yadayim, Ashiyatzar, and then Birkas Torah, and then the Elokai Neshama. Why is that? Why are you putting the Birkas Torah in the middle? Obviously, it seems to be independent. Whether that's because it's a Birkas Hayadah, whether because that's related to the sleep, and as Tibi points out, it's a good ha'ara, it should be early on, it should be as you wake up, essentially, based on this stream. But we see over here is how dependent or independent this bracha is, depends on the nature of this bracha. And by the way, just one last point, this will change the thought process we have when making it. If it is connected to Ashiyatzar, in a certain sense, it is the spiritual parallel of thanking Hashem for existence. If it is about the end of Hamapil, it's really, in a certain sense, framing the sleep experience and understanding the refreshing process of what sleep is meant to be, the soul in, soul out, so to speak. Yeah, John?
It's just interesting. We always try, if we have a way to cover all opinions, to cover it.
Yes.
It seems that if you put Asher Yatzar before it, unless you really want to make the point of it, that you could cover all opinions.
And that's precisely what the poskim say. So the poskim say that it is best to put it together. The Shabura suggests this. Many poskim say that, in fact, the Aruch HaShulchan actually puts it in a more strongly worded thing. He says most of the poskim say it's bracha samuch lechaverta. It relies on Asher Yatzar, so you should say it in such a way. So yes, to be Yotzei Kol Hadeos, that is essentially the idea. But just to be aware of, if that does not happen, it still lives its own independent lifestyle, right? So it still is its own bracha with its own rules. Worthwhile thinking about. Yeah, Toby.
Some people don't say Netilas Yadayim and Ashiyatzar because they get the show. But if you say it beforehand, then you have to then say Elokai Neshama right there.
Technically speaking, yes, exactly. For those doing it at home, it will be part of the package of the home or the home front. Exactly. So that's what it is. And by the way, it's interesting to notice that when the Mishubura talks about this, take a look in source 12, and then the Mishubura codifies as Miyad Achar, V'yeshom in Birkas Elokai Neshama Samucha LeBirkas Ashiyatzar, Al Kain Yavarech by Birkas Torah Achar Elokai Neshama. The Kosal Zeh Primigodim de Nara Upashte. What does that mean? What's Nara Upashte? It's a halachic terminology, which means what's a Nahar? A river, right? Nara, which means you have tributaries of a river. Upashta, each one goes in their own way, which means we need to be consistent. If we are of a tradition that it belongs immediately after Asher Yatzar, that's how we should do it. And if we are not, we should not. Right? So it depends on the family tradition, because these are two viable ideas, and it goes back to the underpinnings of this mitzvah itself. It is interesting to notice the specific language used in this bracha, just for two moments, then we'll close with this. The language used in this bracha is fascinating, in that we use the word neshama. Right now, there are multiple different terms for the soul. Right? In fact, there are 5 different terms for the soul, technically speaking, when appreciating this. So the Chidush HaGaras, the Maharsha, actually in his commentary on the Gemara in Brachos, points out an interesting point in source 13, in the middle of the line, Haneshama b'lishna dekra koleles kol chelkei hanefesh. The word neshama in the text, when you read the Bible, means 3 things. So now he's doing the 3-part division. There are more expanded versions, but the 3-part division is Shem Shlosha, which is 3, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama. So the Kabbalistic and rational thinkers in Judaism say this. Ata barasa ala nefesh ha'ativis shem avivra elokim es adam. Ata yatzarta bi ala ruach ha'chiyoni shem vayitzer elokim es adam. Ata nafachta bi ala neshama sha'asechles. So he says the reason why we say those 3 phrases about Hashem depositing in us relate to the 3 parts, or the 3 main parts of the soul, which relate to our instinctual self. That's what we'll call it. If an animal has a nefesh too, the ruach is the emotional component, the neshama is the spiritual, intellectual component. All those 3, with the glass blower, it's sort of the receiving air through the pipeline and the blower's mouth, so to speak, if one wants to think about in the Kabbalistic terms of how the human being was infused with the neshama. Those are the things which are being returned. Technically speaking, when learning the Ramchal, it is worthwhile noting that it is only the upper parts of the neshama which migrate during sleep. So that would be ruach and neshama upwards. Nefesh, technically speaking, is somewhat tethered. So the instinctual existence of a human being is that spiritual part of the pure human being is tethered to the body. The other ones have a little more flexibility, which might be why we use the word neshama as well, because those are the ones which are migrating further and are returning at this point in time. To be aware of this. We also notice an interesting point is we say Atam Meshamra Bikirbi, you guarded in my midst. There's a really remarkable medrash which says in the Yalkut Tehillim, where we say the very last words of all of Sefer Tehillim, which we say in our davening every day, Kol HaNeshamot Tahalelka, all my soul will praise you. What does that mean? What does it mean, all of our soul? Which parts of it are not or yes? So the Medrash says in the Yalkut, all our existence, our soul, so to speak, is oscillating and trying to escape the confines of us. So how is it tethered to us? How is it bound to us? So really the soul, so to speak, every breath that we're taking, it's trying to leave us, and Hashem is, so to speak, pushing it back. Right? His presence is holding it within us. And so Al-Shech HaKadosh says, that's why we say, Atam Hashem Rabbi Kirbi, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you are ensuring that we remain a spiritual physical being, and not that the spiritual runs away from the crassness of our body, which is very much an antithesis to it. Taking that one step further, Rav Hirsch points out, and that's why, so to speak, the neshama is almost like an internal spiritual agent in our body, which reports the truth. The way he says it in his commentary on the Siddur is the following. He says, take a look at the sentence which begins with, I make acknowledgement, halfway through the paragraph in 16. I make acknowledgement before you, that is, what does it mean? Why do you start admitting to God now? He says, I have no secrets before God. That which my soul knows, God knows, for the soul itself is divine light, which shines through the innermost being. So, meaning to say, because I am tethered to this neshama, which is part of me, and that neshama is a chelek Elokai Mimal, and that's a part of God, that means to say that there's nothing I can hide, because once the neshama returns into me, there's nothing I can hide behind, there's no excuses I can make, because that is, so to speak, all revealing, because that is part of the divine system. I'm on the grid. And therefore there's nothing to be talked about. I'd like to close with perhaps the words of Rav Kook on this, which is in his translation of his commentary. It's not his commentary on the Siddur, it's actually in Orot, but there's a beautiful Siddur which came out recently. Koren published the Rav Kook Siddur, translated by Betzalel Naor, on Rav Kook. Now, it is very hard to read Rav Kook in English, because it's very hard to read Rav Kook in Hebrew. So it's the ideas are much more profound than language can couch. But nonetheless, just to get a sense of this moment, he says, there is an ongoing tension between the infinite light, the Or and Sof, that's the Almighty, which is the source of the soul, and the egoistic and individualistic identity that it must assume for the duration of its bodily sojourn. That was all the tension that Al-Sheikh was talking about, how Hashem sort of preserving that tension. Despite what one may think to the contrary, the purity of the soul is undiminished, because the soul is forever aspiring and to ascend to its lofty source. So on the one hand, it is an agency of the divine. On the other hand, it's stuck with me, right? So it's stuck in me and all the complication, the mud I have to walk through in my life. But Tahirahi, in the end of the day, it still maintains its purity despite everything I'm going through, which in a certain sense is our cord, our ripcord, which allows us to be able to return every day. And which means that no matter how bad yesterday was, as Annie says, tomorrow is always another day, right? So that means to say it's only one day away, where we wake up every morning and we realize that we have the capacity of purity, because the battery has been recharged and has been put back into us and preserved us. The voice is just a fascinating topic. Halachically, machshavically, there's so much to talk about. We'll move on to Birkas Torah next time as well. Thank you for taking the time.